Ikwewug. Baba Moana quad indigenous cause Mong and Dudam. Mash Gazibi Dush Ga Wish Kakabigag Indujiba Nin Anishinaabe. So I just greeted you, sorry, I found a place in my language, and I said hello women relatives, and introduced myself, my Ojibwe name, which means changing sky woman, and my clan, which is the Loon clan. We're the people of the pretty voice, and I'm from the Bad River and Red Cliff bands of Wisconsin Ojibwe, and we actually call Bad Rivers in our languages Mashkazibi, which is Medicine River. And I said that I'm Anishinaabe, I'm an Anishinaabe woman. Native people, we usually introduce ourselves first by our tribal affiliation, rather than Native American or American Indian. That's kind of as descriptive as like calling somebody who's French European. So it doesn't really give very clear of a introduction. I wanted to say Che Miigwech, thank you very much to JAWS for bringing me here, inviting me, and I've had my affiliation with JAWS has been very, very helpful to my career, and I have a lot of gratitude to people who have helped me. It was here that I met Jody Jacobson of Rewire, and she and her crew, Regina Mahoney and her team were so supportive, and helped me to do some work that I'm super proud of. Lisa Shepard, Megan Sways, all these people who have really helped me in my work, and I'm very grateful. So I don't know for sure what they wanted me to do, but this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to share my story and my experience working in mainstream press and I guess the ethnic press. I started in 1986 and still continue to go on today. I was also president and executive director for a time of Native American Journalists Association. I always joked my final goal was to be the administrative assistant, but that actually never happened. The name JAWS has very special personal and cultural meaning for me and my family. The word for old woman in Ojibwe is Mindamoyen, and Mindamoyen is one who holds things together. So in that role, the Mindamoye, we exert a certain amount of direction and guidance for the community, including reminding men of their duties to family and communities. If you visit my country, you'll notice that Ojibwe men have notoriously flat asses. And according to my Uncle Don, who's gone now, those asses got that way because as a result of the Mindamoyans' enthusiastic embrace of their duties to remind them of their men of their duties. So my famous Auntie Pat, who was especially gifted in her role as Mindamoyen, was nicknamed by my Uncle Don Jaws. So that's really means a lot to me. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in small town Wisconsin. My dad was non-native and my mom was Ojibwe. My mom was a big inspiration to me to pursue journalism. She was very civically engaged and engaged in the democratic process. She was not a very well-educated woman. But as an Ojibwe woman and a Mindamoyen herself, she was a great storyteller. And we spent many afternoons where we would lay in bed together and she would tell me about the teachings and also her experience in the sister school. And she had a great sense of indignation, I think, over the injustice that she experienced and that it shouldn't be that way. And sister school was her name for the boarding schools. As it happened, my mom cleaned offices, and she used to clean the office of former Senator Russ Feingold's dad, Leon Feingold. They were like the three Jewish people in the whole town. And Leon and Sylvia were liberal Jewish people. They were very supportive of my mom and encouraged her to become civically involved. And she was active in the Democratic Women's Group, and she went to D.C. and met the president. It was a huge thing for her. So during that time, race and civil rights were constant topics in my home. And engagement with the news. My parents, even though they weren't very well educated, one read the paper. I mean, that is what one did, and that was what I saw. when I grew up. And I knew that the news had tremendous influence over our lives. But what I didn't see when I was looking at either broadcast news or the newspaper, I didn't see Native people depicted very accurately. At least they certainly weren't like anybody that I grew up with, or any of my relatives. So I was inspired. I always knew I wanted to write. When I was a kid, there was like a lot of drama in my house sometimes, and I would hide under the kitchen table and I had this black crayon I would draw with. Even before I could write, I would like sort of make pictures about what was going on. And so I just always knew I would write stories about what was going on. So as I said, I was inspired to, I wanted to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable, I think. And however, as I said, there weren't very many accurate depictions of Native people. Actually, former colleague of mine, Wilda Wapipa, who's Kickapoo and Ho-Chunk, she's now an attorney, but she used to be regional editor at the Oregonian. And she would say, if you see Native people in the paper, it's guided by the 3 Ds. We're dead, drunk, or dancing. And that was pretty much accurate. So I went to school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the J School. And after that, I was a staff shooter, and I used to call us shooters, and I don't even know if they use that language anymore. I was a staff photographer and a photo editor from like 86 to 98 at a bunch of different daily newspapers. And in 2000, I went independent, and I began writing in 2003, and I was on the board of NAJA, Native American Journalists Association, during the Unity years, and met Dorothy during that time. I don't know if she's here. And president in 2000, and the executive director from like 2002 to 2003. So during that time, I saw several waves of diversity programming and training and workshops and efforts to bring more Native people onto the staff and ways to increase coverage of Native people. And I have to say that the language and the approach, since 1986, mind you, has remained remarkably the same. And I haven't seen too much improvement, certainly not in the number of Native journalists hired, or in really the coverage. There's been some notable examples. I think the improvement, but the improvement has been pretty slow. So when I was with NAJA, and of course when I worked at mainstream papers, my employment was often contingent upon it, so I was always a member of the diversity committee. I mean, I always had to do that. So the press, the legacy press, would ask us, we want to improve the numbers, help us, show us what we're doing wrong. Please help us improve. So we tried to. And that's what I have up here. I just thought I would give you like a little historical view of some of our efforts that we did. This is like late 80s, early 90s. We would put together these little guidelines, kind of like, like, I don't know, what a dummy's guide to covering 100 questions, 500 nations. So we made that available, and that's kind of a relic now. It's a historical relic. And then we did this. I was real involved in this one. You see the copy's kind of dog-eared. That was in the 90s. And then some of my young colleagues now, they've made some online resources available. It's kind of tiny, sorry. But you can go to the NAJA website and you can see some of that if you would like. And then this one, kind of one of the more cynical members of our group. It is sort of like but it's a big, if you score a bingo, you better take a hard look at that piece, right? I mean, yeah, it's kind of cute. So I'm going to go back a little bit. So sometimes we got some Native people hired, but they wouldn't stay on. They would say they didn't really feel very supported, and it just was not a fit for them, and their perspective wasn't valued. So I grew kind of frustrated over the years with that experience. I mean, the efforts and the language and the claims, they weren't really matching the outcomes, the actions that I was seeing. And so I'm going to share some of my observations over the years. During the 90s, as the internet, was changing our work and gaining greater influence, and people were not consuming as much broadcast news and newspapers. News organizations, I don't know, maybe some of you will remember, they began convening these town halls and engaging in something called civic journalism. And they would meet, and the editors would come, and they would invite people. And these were people who were like super involved in the community, people who were really civically minded. And Because I was a member of NAJA, ASNI, the Associated, what is ASNI like an acronym for? I even forget. It's American Society of Newspaper Editors. So I would go to some of these things, right? You know, these big cities. Pardon me?
News editors, if they had to drop newspapers.
Oh, of course. See, I've been out of the loop. But at any rate, I was really shocked at how arrogant and dismissive some of the editors were to people who came, you know, and these are people, volunteers who came, and I thought, this is not so good. There was like this kind of air of that we're this priestly class, and we shall tell you, you know, what the news is and what's newsworthy, and people were mad about it, and I think that, for me, I don't know, that observation, you know, it resonated for me. I saw there was a classism, I guess an awareness of, I was able to identify a classism and an elitism that I saw in journalism. And I really feel that, you know, there was during that time, I think people, you know, our business could have done really much better. In many ways, I think we squandered the public trust, you know, at this place we're at now, and some of it is you know, in many ways, I think the mainstream press contributed to it. As Mark Trahan said, who's a Shoshone Bannock editor about my age, and he's the new editor of Indian Country Today, he said the journalists moved from a beer drinking class to a wine class, you know? And, you know, the journalists of my parents' era, that journalism, you know, had changed in a way that was, I think, that was kind of alienating for a lot of people. And that certain elitism, I think it really informed and permeated a lot of newsrooms. The message was certain people are newsworthy, certain events are newsworthy, and certain ones aren't. Also during this time, I went to this talk, an ASNI talk, given by John Levine. He was a former dean of the Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern. And he, well, you didn't like him? Yeah, I don't know. Oh, sorry. Well, you know, I didn't hang with him, right? I don't know. But one of the things he said, what he talked about, he compared journalism to like the military and healthcare, like hospitals, these grand institutions. And as institutions, there's sort of one way that legitimate news enters, and there's one way, you know, that it's reported about. And that for me really resonated, and that made a lot of sense to me. That, you know, so who decides what's legitimate news? Well, you know, the people who own the newspapers and the people who run them, the editors, and we're primarily white men. And I think that really, you know, that said to me that this aesthetic, if you will, very much informs the guidelines and the measures of what is news. So as a journalist of color, I came to see that really our success depended upon our ability to walk that walk and talk that talk. You know, and then we would be called articulate and various things like this. You know, it was really about our ability to fit in. And, you know, that, for me, was very, I think for a lot of people, has been very, very frustrating. I mean, you could be successful if you did that, but if you wanted to bring your perspective to the work, you know, you often find yourself dismissed. And many people, out of frustration, you know, would leave. And I concluded that legacy press's efforts to increase coverage of communities of color and to increase the number of journalists of color, they weren't sincere. I mean, in order to do that, you know, all you have to change is everything. And they ain't gonna do that. At least I don't think they're gonna. They're very big journalism is super, and that's what I call it, big science. My husband's an academic and he's in geography, so big science, he says. So I say big journalism is resistant to change and averse to criticism, in my experience. Again, these are my opinions. This is how I've lived it. Now, I've seen some programs, you know, that were occasionally pretty well funded, and people were super sincere and very nice. I mean, really good. Okay, stop. I mean, people I count as for good people, you know. But it's not about intention. It's not about you. It's about what actually happens. And people have a hard time with that, a really hard time with that. You know, I pitched a lot when I was working for the mainstream press. I would pitch stories about Native people I wanted to cover because that's what I wanted to do. And I was always told I didn't have sufficient objectivity to do that. I wouldn't be able to do that. And at one point, I was getting more and more frustrated, and I asked an editor, well, you're sending these white male reporters off to City Hall to cover politicians are primarily white men. Do you have any concern about their ability to maintain objectivity? He said, Pember, you're such a smart ass. Get out of here. So, I quit. I never looked back. There was a phrase, I don't know if people remember, some people in the room might remember, in the 60s and 70s, one would see all these posters, and so people were challenging a lot of sort of societal norms, and there was a phrase, smash the state and build something beautiful in its place. And I decided I'm not really interested in expending the energy to smash the state, but I'm building something beautiful in its place. And I don't really care if the state thinks it's rigorous enough or legitimate, or I just stopped worrying about that. I've just been, I've been building something beautiful. So I quit, and I started, I was a shooter primarily, and so I was shooting, but my daughter was determined to be autistic. Actually, she's got some genetic thing, and I don't even care what it's called either. One doesn't care about these labels, It's just, she needed me. I needed physically to be there, not chasing all over the country taking pictures. At least I decided that that's what I needed to do, so that's what I did. And the truth of it was, I always did want to be a writer, but I was too shy and too not confident enough, and I wasn't encouraged, and except being under that table, with that black crayon. But for me, although I never told anybody this at the time, photography is concentrated writing, really. It's conveying, in this sort of, often in sort of these ethereal ways that words can't quite describe, it really does forward the story. So I just, it's still writing and reporting to me. And so I started to write. So I pitched some stories, I started to write, and danged if I didn't get paid. So I kept doing it. Fortunately, I had these fantastic colleagues I had worked with over the years who really helped me learn the craft of journalism. And I was able to turn to them for help. Because I'd be, oh my God, a FOIA request, how do I even do that? I don't know. And then having to crunch data and all these various things. So I had these fantastic people. I worked with actually Bill Bishop and his wife Julie Artery, who have both been editors at the Lexington Herald-Leader, and started this rural news site for the Center for Rural Strategies called the Daily Yonder. They helped me a lot and really taught me how to do the work. During that time, I met Michel Ducille, who's passed now, unfortunately, and he was director of photography, or I think he was like photo editor at the Washington Post. I had put together this piece about the Ho-Chunk Nation in Nebraska is fighting diabetes in their community, and they weren't evidence-based practices, but they were working, and I wanted to write about what people were actually doing in their communities to address problems and kind of stuff that was working. So he got me a double truck in the Washington Post, and it was a beautiful thing. It was like really, really good, and I got on the map a little bit more. And I began working for Indian Country Today. They were owned at that time by the Oneida Nation of New York, and they didn't pay a lot, but they paid enough. And I lived the dream. I kind of, whatever I wanted to do, they would just let me do. Actually, the people who were editors were non-natives. This man, it's just it was kind of an unusual situation, not kind of, it was a super unusual situation. Chris Napolitano, who had been an editor for Playboy, and this other man, Bob Rowe, who, and I never met Bob in person, and I never really spent any time with these people. It was all, we had this digital relationship, but they made my writing better. They were respectful to me, and I didn't have to see them, And it was like, I didn't have to, I always felt like if it was kind of like one time I went to New York, and I thought, oh, I'll meet Bob and say hi to him. And it was so weird how it fell that I didn't get to meet him. And I just took that as a gift from the creator, because I think I would have hated him. I think he would have represented something that would have triggered me, and I think, as I had been treated in the past, very dismissively, and I would have felt minimized by him, and you know what? Somehow, the internet has just saved my life. And I've been so blessed, I've just gotten the good things from these people. So finally, in my old age, it's like my mom was always say, oh, you always have to go poking. You always have to keep going. And I just didn't go poking. I left it. And that was like really a good thing. So, during this time, I just dove into the complex historical and political underpinnings of the rather narrow depictions that have defined us, Native people in the legacy press, and I reported like an Ojibwe woman from the ground up. And I spoke to the aunties, the cousins, grandparents, and kids who do the business of living in Indian country. Jackie Banishevsky, who's actually from Wisconsin, former night chair in editing at the Missouri School of Journalism, and a fellow at the Poynter Institute, she once described great journalists as wingwalkers, those air show barnstormers who wandered on the edge of airplanes mid-flight. Indian Country editors Indian Country Today editors encouraged us to really venture out on those wings, and it was a beautiful thing. Our work in Indian Country Today challenged and continues to challenge the mainstream press's coverage of sexual violence, epidemic of sexual violence, and high rates of murdered and missing Native women. At Indian Country Today, we explain that these epidemics are sudden only in their acknowledgement by white folks. Violence, including instances of murder, sex trafficking, domestic abuse against Native women, they're ongoing issues that have been hundreds of years in the making. The real epidemic, in my view, has been the mainstream press's historic failure to cover missing and murdered Indigenous women. Our victims weren't worthy enough. Our victims have messy lives. We may be involved with substances. And, I did a piece on sex trafficking around the port city of Duluth. And growing up, I would often hear about, women, oh, where's so-and-so? Oh, she's working the boats. Hear my accent. And then, either, Philomene or whatever her name, Philomene would disappear or not. And nobody much cared. It was sort of part of the rough and tumble atmosphere of a port city. Prostitutes weren't covered. We didn't really care. And our community was too ashamed to say anything about it, really. You didn't report. Cops weren't going to do nothing. But suddenly, I don't know what moved the needle, but the mainstream press has begun to cover. There's so many, it's not just Native women, there's so many instances of if you want to kill people, okay, just write this down. If you want to kill people and get away with it, you probably want to kill people of color who are living a marginal lifestyle, involved in some sort of illegal activity. Historically, the cops have not done much, and the press didn't report on it. So there have been many, if we look back, a great example is the story about the Grim Sleeper, he was called, in Los Angeles. I mean, it was black women on the ground, activists, who just really pushed, for that to be investigated. And that man people in the neighborhood even kind of knew what he was doing, I mean, he got away with it for generations. So, although I just sort of chafe at this, this epidemic, it's like, yeah. But I guess I am happy that it's gaining more coverage, and maybe we can see a little bit more attention, placed on awareness of cops, and that even though these women, may have been involved with drugs or prostitution, they're still somebody's sister, somebody's mother. People still love them. And I think, that acknowledgement is kind of huge. And I don't know how much it's, going to have an impact, but I sure hope it does. I have to say that, the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline, near Standing Rock, it elevated us a bit in the media. Overall, we still remain defined by our plight and our gold standard of despair, I like to call it. And we're reliable chart toppers in the categories of poverty, addiction, violence, and suicide. Big journalism just can't resist that. It's just too sexy. And they really tend, I think they take a real reductionist approach, which is ultimately super racist. I mean, to sort of disallow people the same complexity you do everybody else. Oh, Indians think this. It's like, I continue. Since when do white people get to have the market cornered on normal? What's up with that anyway, I'm getting off my topic a little bit. So, recently I was interviewed with this young fellow, Luke Ottenhoff, for a piece he did called On Native Grounds, along with Tristan Ottone, who's a Pawnee journalist. He's the current NAJA president. He's really on a young little smarty pants. He's really good. And he's editor at High Country News, the Native Desk, and he had a Neiman Fellowship. recently, and during his fellowship, he had planned to develop ethics guidelines for covering indigenous communities. Ooh, I want to get to my thing. This is, I wanted to just mention, I'm sorry, I'll go back a little. This is a piece when I did with Rewire News and Indian Country Today, looking at missing and murdered indigenous women, because I was up in Canada, and they were like so far ahead on, they actually, were able to get like a grant from the government, and these women, they just went out, boots on the ground, and went to every day community and said, okay, how many women you got missing here, right? So they actually counted them, and I knew, that border, the medicine line we call it, we don't recognize that. Our community straddled that line, so I knew it had to be the same here. So I started writing about it a little bit, and I think it helped to give some legs to the story. I think in my way, I have helped forward some stuff, some important issues, and I guess when it all comes down to it, that's really kind of what it's about for me. That I helped bring some additional attention. So back to Tristan. So he wanted to develop these ethics guidelines for the mainstream press to cover indigenous communities and issues, and he realized that they already existed. It's called the Society of Professional Journalists, already has these guidelines. And he says, there's no sense in coming up. The existing guidelines, he said, really did a good enough job. And if our industry, it is all about accountability, except when it's about ourselves. And, changing, as I said, all you have to change is everything. I mean, it requires, for the institution, that institution of journalism, it requires like this deep soul searching and reconciliation with some really difficult history. And, calling on some people of color to, quote unquote, help do that, in some ways it just puts the burden on us to fix something that we didn't even create in the first place. But you can't really fix it, without willingness, if people really don't have genuine willingness. There's a phrase in Alcoholics Anonymous, I'll share with you. I'm a recovering alcoholic. I drank a lot when I was working in the business. It's funny, my drinking really got bad when I was working. As soon as I quit the job, I quit drinking. I was able to quit drinking. But I was an alcoholic, I would have drank anyway. But anyway, the phrase in AA is like, there are some people who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. So you can't like force people to that. You just can't. And, I decided it's not my job to do that. And I just was getting really mad and feeling hurt and resentful and just kind of sick. And I just decided, I'm not dying on this hill. I'm just going to build something beautiful. So that's what I've been doing. And thank you. So it's, we became, I think, so we've seen as Native people, Native journalists, we've seen all of these efforts over the years, and we just got tired of waiting, for the mainstream press to decide we were rigorous enough, or I don't know what to decide, if we should be included in coverage and in our ranks. And so, we just started doing it ourselves. Mark Trehant, recently Indian Country Today, used to be, as I said, was owned by the Oneida Nation of New York, and they ran out of money doing it. Never made any money anyway. And they donated it to the National Congress of the American Indians, and Mark Trehant has become the editor. And he just said, we're just going to do stuff. We're just going to be bold. So we wanted to, as you probably know, there's been this last election cycle, there's like more indigenous women than ever before. So we just covered it, man. We just went out with our phones, and we got these little external microphones, and we just used like the hotel internet. And so we just went over the country. We covered it live. And I got to cover Peggy Flanagan's election, and she's Ojibwe, she's in Minnesota, she's the first Native lieutenant governor. I think it's like the highest office ever elected. So that was like super gratifying to me to get to do that. So, as you said, we're tired of waiting, and Mark is as he's going out and pitching, and we're wildly popular. He wanted to create, he's really based it on, there was this Cherokee man named Elias Boudinot, and he was born in 1802, and he created, I think it's probably we think it was the first native newspaper called Cherokee Phoenix in 1828, and he envisioned it as a vehicle of native intelligence. So that's what we're doing. And I'm having so much fun, you know. And I got to tell you, you know, you don't make a whole lot of money doing this. It better be fun. It better be fun, at least for me. And if I'm having fun, you know, I'm there, and I am just, you know, enjoying the heck out of it. I did this piece about. I got a couple of awards, a couple of fellowships. One with Rosalind Carter's, it was this mental health fellowship, and another organization that I won't mention. The other organization I wanted to write about historical trauma and the impact, you know, on Native peoples, and a lot of it is like about just kind of unpacking my own, you know, isms, my own family's dealings with historical traumas. My mother was a boarding school survivor, and she was a difficult person. She had a lot of stuff, a lot of baggage, and it was hard. She's a difficult person, very harsh. And I realized that I began writing about it, and I got a tremendous response. So I realized that this is something more to write about. So as I said, this secondary fellowship that I received to do this work, they told me, well, after they flew me out to their headquarters, and they said, well, you know, we want you to only cover efforts that are evidence-based practices. And I said, well, that's a shame, because I don't want to do that. I want to cover, I want to write about what people are really doing that works, and that stuff that people are going to and are getting help from. So I said, you know, you didn't mention that in the call for the proposals. If you want to take the money back, you can. But of course, Rosalind Carter, being a very classy lady that she is, and her organization, they completely supported me. So I wrote about all this stuff about trauma, about how to, you know, the epigenetics of trauma. So I got to go into science a little bit, and it was wildly popular. And Indian Country Today created this big download, you know, looking at all the impact of historical trauma, both sort of, I did some personal look at my own family, and then just sort of, you know, some health issues and psychological issues. And the heck of it is now, when the Oneidas gave Indian Country Today to NCAI, the server did not transfer over, but I've got everything saved on Authory, so you can't, not everything is super searchable any longer, which sort of sucks. But I do have pretty much everything on my website if you would care to look at it. My favorite thing I wrote was about this sex trafficking in Duluth, and I met this lady, Mary G., who really, it was like, I went to her house, and she was standing in the doorway, and I felt like I was meeting myself. It was really something I hadn't anticipated. It's really been very, it's very personal, very spiritual, this work to me. It's very enriching. And if it doesn't do, I'll say, if it doesn't fill this and this, I ain't gonna do it. So, and then I wrote this piece about, you know, I've been writing a lot about my mom's sister school experience, and I just happened to call the Atlantic. I actually got a young fellow there who became my champion, and so they actually accepted it, and we published that, and I'm like, woohoo, big deal. So it's kind of, yeah, that's kind of cool. We pinned it on, you know, it was the anniversary of the Civilization Act. And then I did this big thing about Me Too in Indian Country, again, very complex. And most recently, and I encourage people to really take a look at this, the OST tribe on Pine Ridge in South Dakota became the first tribe to pass a hate crime law that also offers protections for LGBTQ citizens. And that ran Thursday, I'm hoping, and it's very complex, you know, not everybody supported it. Like the Lakota word, the word that they use for LGBTQ folks is winkte. And so I talked to some elders that I knew, and I talked to this one guy, and he said, oh, you talked about how the winkte are so important, and we always include them, like in our Sundance ceremonies, and here's what they do, blah, blah, blah. And then I talked to this other, and both of these people now, mind you, are native Lakota language speakers, and I talked to this other lady. She says, oh, those winkte, they used to be sacred, but they're not sacred anymore. We should drive them out. And then I talked to another person who said, well, winkte is like a pejorative term. We don't even use that. That sort of emerged in the 40s. So guess what? We're pretty complicated, just like everybody else, you know? But in the end, they passed it because they were worried about their kids. You know, there's such a high rate of suicide related to, and violence and stuff related to LGBTQ folks on the reservation. I mean, we're talking about rural, isolated communities, you know? It's a hard road to go. And it's, as I was telling Alyssa, it's a recipe for an ass whooping, to come out in a place like that. And it can be very difficult. So I would ask people to do that. And I'm actually started jingle dress dancing. I built my own jingle dresses. We're celebrating as my people, the ones, Ojibwe people, we're the ones who created the jingle dress. We're celebrating 100 years of the jingle dress. And it's like kind of I'm wanting to really look at, the influence. My mother never would have dreamt of being able to do this in her life, and how really I'm going to kind of look at it from a personal perspective, and we see the jingle dress as a healing, the dance itself is a healing dance, and the dress is a healing dress, and so I'm exploring that. That's currently what I'm messing around with. And then I got some books that I thought if you guys are interested in, I would just sort of throw up, and I've got this on a little PowerPoint. People always say, oh, what books can I read? Here's some books you can read. This is an old book by Vine Deloria, who's one of our great Lakota thinkers. He's passed now, but gives you, I think, a really good perspective on Native spirituality. And this as well. This is I talked to you about Minda Moyen. Brenda Childs is a tremendous Ojibwe scholar. She's a professor at the University of Minnesota. She talks a lot about the role of Native women, particularly Ojibwe women, and in the community. And this is a very interesting book. It's written by a non-Indian from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he talks a lot about how the alliance between Native people and environmentalists, on the ground, has really informed a lot of the policies and practices. So he's really very good perspective. Zoltan Grossman, which is kind of a crazy name. And this is a recent book that's come out. It's very good. And David Troyer, also Ojibwe. I guess I'm sort of Ojibwe-centric. But, hey, what can I do? We do good stuff. So it's a very good book looking at resiliency, and how we're still here, we still have our languages, we still have our ways, we are just we are the scrappiest people on earth, I feel like, and we're the people to watch. So that's the end of my talk, I guess.